Imagine a world wrapped in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that gnaws at your bones. A silence broken only by the sound of wind clawing at wooden doors, and the faint creak of ice on a frozen roof. This is not the cozy winter we know today. This is Europe, the year 1315, a time when winter meant fear. There are no heaters. No electricity. No comfort. Just a dim fire, a single blanket, and hope, fragile as a candle in a storm. In a small wooden hut on the edge of a frostbitten forest, a boy named Edric stares at a fire that's slowly dying. He's no more than 10 years old, his cheeks red from the cold, his eyes hollow from hunger. His mother sits beside him, stirring a pot of what used to be soup, now just melted snow with a few thin slices of turnip floating in it. His father, Roderick, left 2 days ago to hunt. He promised to bring meat. He promised to come back. But the snow hasn't stopped falling. And promises don't fill empty stomachs. Do you think father found a deer? Edric asks, his voice trembling as the wind rattles the door. His mother smiles weakly, though her lips are cracked and pale. He will, my love. He always does. But they both know the truth, the forest is silent. Even the wolves have stopped howling. Outside, the world is buried under ice. The path that led to the village is gone, swallowed by white. The river is frozen solid, and the trees stand like ghosts in the fog. That night, the cold becomes unbearable. The little fire flickers, struggling against the breath of the wind. Edric pulls his blanket tighter. His mother hums softly, an old lullaby from warmer days, but even her song sounds brittle, like glass ready to break. Then, a noise. The door creaks open. Roderick stands there, snow on his shoulders, his beard frosted white. His eyes are dull from exhaustion. In his hands, only a small handful of frozen berries. "It's all I could find," he whispers. His voice cracks with shame. He drops the berries into the pot. They melt instantly, turning the water a faint red. That night, they eat in silence. Each pretends to be full so the other can take more. But everyone goes to sleep hungry. And outside, the wind screams through the night. Like a warning from the gods that worse is yet to come. The morning sun rises weak and gray. Frost coats everything, the door hinges, the windows, even the family's clothes. Roderick steps outside, his breath fogging the air. He looks toward the forest. He knows he must try again. But in that frozen silence, even his footsteps sound like they don't belong. He doesn't see it, but far beyond the woods, dark clouds are gathering. And with them, something Europe hasn't seen in centuries. A winter so cruel it will change the fate of millions. The Great Famine has begun. The sun didn't rise the next morning, not really. It only glowed faintly behind thick clouds, spreading a pale, colorless light that felt more like the memory of daylight than the real thing. The village lay buried in silence. The snow had grown so deep that even the church bell was half covered. No one went outside unless they had to. The air itself seemed heavy, freezing tears before they could fall. Inside their hut, Edric's family huddled close to the dying fire. The little warmth it gave was not enough. Roderick's hands were swollen and raw. His wife's lips had turned blue. And Edric, young, fragile, yet full of stubborn hope, tried to smile whenever his mother looked at him, just to make her believe they could survive this. But survival was becoming a word too heavy to carry. That week, Roderick tried hunting again. He went deeper into the woods than ever before, through snow that swallowed his legs, across frozen streams that cracked beneath his boots. He followed faint animal tracks, maybe a deer, maybe a wolf, until his breath came out in short, white bursts. Then, he saw it. A stag, thin and weak, standing in the distance. A gift from God, perhaps. Roderick nocked an arrow, his hands trembling. He drew back the string, and just as he released it, his fingers gave out. The arrow missed. The stag ran. And Roderick fell to his knees in the snow, whispering a prayer through chattering teeth. By the time he returned home, his hands were blackened with frostbite. 2 fingers were gone before the night was over. Edric didn't sleep that night. He watched his mother wrap his father's hands in cloth, whispering prayers she barely remembered. The wind howled against the roof, a cruel, mocking sound. Outside, across the village, things were worse. The baker's wife had burned all her chairs for warmth. Old Thomas, the carpenter, froze to death sitting beside an empty hearth. And in the churchyard, the first shallow graves were dug. The ground too hard to bury the dead properly. Still, every night, Edric's mother lit a candle. Every night, she whispered, "Spring will come." But spring, it seemed, had forgotten them. By midwinter, even the abbey, the heart of hope for the poor, was running out of grain. The monks began rationing bread, a single piece per day, for each family that could still walk to the church. Roderick could no longer move. His body was too weak, his spirit fading. So one morning, before dawn, Edric's mother made a choice. She wrapped her son in wool and whispered, "We're going to the abbey, Edric. There's food there. The monks will help us." He looked at his father lying still on the bed of straw. "Will father come?" She smiled faintly, though her eyes filled with tears. "He'll follow us soon." They stepped outside. The world was white and endless. Each breath hurt. Each step felt like walking through smoke. Snowflakes fell so slowly they looked like ashes drifting from heaven. The forest loomed dark and hollow, every branch coated in frost. Edric held his mother's hand tightly. "Will we make it?" "We will," she said softly. "We must." For hours, they walked through the blizzard. Their feet sank into the snow, their cloaks heavy with ice. The silence was crushing, only the sound of their breathing and the faint crunch of snow beneath them. But as night began to fall, the mother slowed. Her steps grew weaker, her breathing shallow. "Mother?" Edric whispered. She smiled again, that same fragile smile she gave him when there was nothing left to give. "We'll stop here for tonight," she said. They found shelter beneath an old oak tree, its hollow trunk wide enough for 2. She started a small fire using the last of their dry wood. Its light flickered softly across her face. "Do you remember summer, Edric?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The wheat fields, the river, your laughter." He nodded, his eyes glassy. "I remember." She brushed his hair from his face, her hand trembling. "Then remember it always. No matter how cold the world becomes." He fell asleep beside her, the fire dimming to embers. When he woke the next morning, the fire was out. And his mother was still. Snow had gathered gently on her shoulders, as if the world itself was trying to cover her in peace. Edric cried until no sound came out, only white fog from his breath. Then, through the blur of tears, he saw it, a wooden cross in the distance. The Abbey Tower. He stood up, shaking, numb, and began to walk. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he didn't stop. Not until the monks found him collapsed near the gates, frozen and half-conscious, still holding his mother's scarf in his hand. When Edric opened his eyes, he was wrapped in blankets, lying beside a roaring fire. A monk smiled down at him gently. "You're safe now, child." But Edric didn't feel safe. He looked at the fire, the bread beside him, the warmth, and he thought of his father's hands, his mother's smile, the snow-covered silence outside. And deep inside, he made a promise. He would remember. He would never forget what the winter took, and what it left behind. When Edric awoke days later, he no longer felt cold, only empty. The monks had wrapped him in thick blankets, fed him warm broth, and placed him near the abbey's great fire. But no warmth could thaw the frost that had settled in his heart. He was safe, but he was alone. The abbey walls were tall and strong, built from grey stone that held the chill of the season. Inside, the smell of burning tallow and incense filled the air. Candles flickered in long rows before carved statues of saints who had seen far too many winters like this one. Brother Aldwin, a kind monk with a gentle voice, stayed by Edric's side. "You are among friends now," he said softly. The Lord has guided you here. If the Lord guided me here, why did he take my mother? The monk didn't answer right away. He simply laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. Sometimes, he said quietly, God tests us through the cold, so we may carry warmth to others. Edric didn't understand then. But he never forgot those words. The weeks that followed were heavy and slow. Outside the abbey walls, the world was still locked in ice. Villagers came to the gates every day, desperate, starving, pleading for food. The monks gave what they could, small loaves of bread, bowls of thin soup, even water from melted snow. But even they were running out. One night, Edric heard Brother Aldwin praying in the chapel. Lord, grant us strength. We have no more wheat in the stores, no more wood to burn. Yet your children still come to our door. Edric listened from the shadows. He was only a child, but something inside him stirred, a fierce need to help, to do something. So the next morning, he gathered the courage to ask, Brother, can I help give food to the people? Aldwin smiled. You may. But remember, we give not from plenty, but from faith. And so, little Edric became a helper of the abbey. He carried baskets of bread to the gates, handed out cups of warm water, and helped bury the dead when the ground softened enough to dig. Each day, he saw the same thing, pale faces, trembling hands, and eyes that looked just like his mother's did before she fell asleep for the last time. He began to understand what Aldwin meant. The cold was not just in the air, it was in people's hearts. And if he could warm even one heart, maybe he could fight the winter itself. Years passed slowly. The famine lasted 3 long years, years of endless snow, failed harvests, and lost souls. When the skies finally cleared, Europe was forever changed. Many villages vanished. Noble families fell into ruin. And the peasants who survived learned to fear the clouds themselves. For even rain could mean death. Edric grew tall and strong. The monks taught him to read, to pray, to write on parchment with quill and ink. But what they couldn't teach him was how to forget. Every time he saw snow fall, he saw his mother's face. Every time he heard the wind howl, he remembered his father's frozen hands. So he began to write. Late at night, when the abbey was silent, Edric wrote in the dim candlelight, stories of the famine, of hunger, of the people who endured. He wrote their names, their lives, their pain. He wrote so that someday, someone would know what they suffered. One cold evening, Brother Aldwin found him asleep over his parchment. The monk smiled softly. Still awake, my son? Edric blinked. I just don't want them to be forgotten. Aldwin placed a hand on his shoulder. Then they never will be. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, gentle, almost kind this time. Edric looked through the window at the white flakes drifting down and whispered. You can fall all you want. You won't break me again. Because the boy who had once been broken by the cold had learned to carry warmth in his heart, the kind no winter could steal. But the story doesn't end here. As years turned to decades, Edric's writings began to spread across the lands. Kings, scholars, and peasants alike would one day read his words, and through them, they would remember the winter that nearly erased humanity's hope. A winter that was more than just cold. It was a test, and somehow, humanity passed. The years rolled on like quiet waves, slow, steady, and relentless. The once small boy, Edric, was no longer a child of hunger and frost. He had become Brother Edric, a monk of the same abbey that had saved his life decades ago. His hair was streaked with gray now, his hands rough from years of work and prayer, but his eyes still carried that same calm fire, the light of someone who had survived the unthinkable and refused to forget. Every winter, when snow began to fall again, the same fear crept through the nearby villages. The peasants still shivered in thin homes, still prayed for mercy, still looked to the abbey for warmth and bread. And every year, Brother Edric made sure the abbey gates were open, no matter how little they had. He remembered. He always remembered. Brother Edric, one of the younger monks, said one morning, we can't feed them all. The stores are running low. Edric turned, his breath visible in the cold air. Then feed them what we have, he replied calmly. A half-loaf is still a gift when given with faith. The monk frowned. And if we starve? Edric smiled softly. Then we will know what they feel, and perhaps that is what God intends. That winter was not as deadly as the famine of 1315, but it was cruel in its own way. The snow came early, and the cold seeped into bones as though it remembered its old victims. One night, as the wind screamed outside, the abbey door burst open. A group of villagers stumbled in, a young woman, a child in her arms, and an old man dragging behind. The woman's lips were blue, her eyes, wide with fear. Please, she gasped. My son, he hasn't eaten in days. Edric rushed to her side, his heart pounding. He took the boy from her trembling hands. The child was no older than 5, pale and thin. He placed the boy near the fire, wrapping him in a wool cloak. You are safe here, little one, he said gently. You're safe now. The woman began to weep, tears of exhaustion and relief. As Edric watched her, a wave of memory struck him like cold wind. He saw himself again, small, frightened, clinging to his mother in the snow. He saw the same desperation, the same hope in her eyes that his mother once had. But this time, the days passed. The storm outside raged, but inside the abbey, life flickered quietly. Edric shared his bread with the villagers. He prayed with them, listened to their fears, and told them stories of the winter that nearly ended him. He told them about his father, who hunted with frostbitten hands. About his mother, who smiled even as the snow took her last breath. And about the boy who walked alone through the storm, not because he was brave, but because love made him unbreakable. The villagers listened in silence, tears reflecting the firelight. Brother, the young woman whispered, how did you survive such a winter? Edric looked into the flames. By remembering that even in the coldest night, there was always one thing the winter could never freeze, hope. Years later, the famine would pass, as all winters do. Fields would grow again, rivers would thaw, and children would laugh under a gentler sun. But Edric, old now, with eyes soft as candlelight, knew the cold would always return. So he spent his final years writing, not just about pain, but about endurance. About love, about faith, and about the strange beauty of surviving. He wrote not for kings, not for history, but for the children who would one day face their own winters, to remind them that every storm ends, and every night gives way to dawn. On the last winter of his life, as snow began to fall once more, Brother Edric sat by the window of his chamber, parchment before him. He looked out at the white field stretching to the horizon and smiled. He dipped his quill in ink, and with a shaking hand, wrote his final words. We feared the cold, yet it taught us warmth. We cursed the winter, yet it taught us faith. For every frost that bites, there is a fire that never dies. He set the quill down, folded his hands, and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind quieted, as if the world itself was pausing to honor him. Brother Edric had come full circle. From a boy who survived the cold, to a man who became its light. The snow fell quietly that morning. It covered the abbey, the fields, and the graves behind the church with a soft white blanket, the same kind of snow that once brought fear and hunger, but now, somehow, felt peaceful. The monks rang the bell just after dawn. Brother Edric's chamber was still. His hands were folded, his face calm, and on the desk before him lay the parchment with his final words, ink dried beside a burned-out candle. He was gone. But his story had just begun. The years passed. The famine became a memory, then a legend, then a line in dusty history books. But within the walls of that old abbey, Edric's writings remained. Bound carefully in leather and stored in the abbey library, his journals told not only of hunger and loss but of endurance, compassion, and the courage to remain human in a world that seemed to have forgotten warmth. Villagers came to read them, travelers too, merchants, scholars, mothers, and children. And as they read, many wept. They wept not because the stories were sad, but because they were true. Because they saw their own struggles reflected in the pages. One passage became known across the land, copied and shared by monks in other abbeys, whispered in villages whenever winter came again. Even when the world freezes, hearts can still burn bright. No storm lasts forever, for hope is older than the cold. Centuries rolled on. The abbey grew old and crumbled, its stones worn smooth by time. The monks were gone, replaced by silence and ivy climbing up the walls. But one day, long after Brother Edric's bones had turned to dust, a young historian named Clara discovered his writings while studying ancient famine records. She brushed off the dust, carefully opening the faded pages. The first thing she read were his words. About a boy, his mother, and a winter that refused to end. By the time she finished reading, her eyes were full of tears. This, she whispered to herself, isn't just history. This is humanity. And so, she published his story, the journals of Brother Edric of the Great Famine. People across Europe read it, generations after he lived. Teachers told it to students. Parents told it to their children when the first snow of winter fell. And every reader found the same truth hidden in those pages. That even in the harshest, coldest times, there is always someone who keeps the fire alive. As centuries turned into modern days, the world changed. Heaters replaced fires. Supermarkets replaced harvests. But the human heart remained the same. And on some cold winter nights, when snow drifts past lonely windows, someone still reads Edric's words, whispers them softly, and feels that ancient warmth rise again. We feared the cold, yet it taught us warmth. We cursed the winter, yet it taught us faith. For every frost that bites, there is a fire that never dies. The camera would fade slowly now. The snow still falling, the abbey bell echoing faintly in the distance. And then, silence. Not the silence of fear this time, but the silence of peace. Because though medieval winters were brutal, they forged hearts that refused to break. And maybe, that's the truest warmth humanity ever found.